I think the best way to think of it is to say there is a national question by virtue of the fact that there is a nation and there are nations, and so it's either only a bourgeois demand, in which case we just reject it altogether, and that's that for a lot of people in the Second International and even today,
Hmm.
that's a lot of people who think that, and I think it's very unhelpful, to be honest. The other way to think of it is to say, well, since there is a national question, and so that means whether it's national autonomy, national independence, whatever it is, that question is going to pose itself until it gets resolved. And so, since that is going to be the case, it's either going to be asserted as a bourgeois demand or as a proletarian demand. And if it can be made a proletarian demand, uh, the question which I would pose, which I think is rhetorical and is very obvious, is shouldn't it be?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I completely agree.
and since it should be, um, we should recognize that there is both a political and an economic character. So, like, if you were like a Chechen, or if you live in Dagestan in the 1870s, you might say we should be independent so that we can be free of the Russian Empire and finally, like, whatever, have the choice to make our own way. But then one of the rejoinders might be a very simple one, which is this: like, economically, this new state's not going to be viable unless it is a little minor principality, little like the Bantustans in South Africa.
Hmm.
And even then, it will be economically entirely independent, even if it is nominally politically independent. So the proletarian, what is being called the proletarian demand, is to recognize that the political dependence is an economic necessity. So what's another way to work our way through these questions, which in a more satisfactory way? And I really do think that the Soviets kind of figured this out to at least to date, probably in the best way.
I
Um,
mean,
yeah,
yeah, I think Bauer, by posing the question, highlights just like a fundamental problem with, again, and this is why I think like his critique of like the territorial principle is good, is that he highlights the fact that if we are to accept that the progressive nature of capitalism, like what is the progressive nature of capitalism? It is the construction and then expansion of these economic zones into like into what one could maybe point to as like one economic zone. And
right.
so like the idea of like the territorial principle is actually taking down those economic zones, making these nations uh, economically unviable to sustain themselves. And so how are we able to create a political independence while maintaining these political like economic zones that allow for a larger apparatus is a like necessary question, I think, and one that like the Soviet Union reckoned with and was reckoning with until its collapse.
That's why I really appreciate which is basically the second entry in your notes, which is a quote from Bauer. He says that the simplest form in which the realization of national autonomy can be imagined is the constitution of the nation as a territorial corporation. That there is that is like a method of trying to maintain the distinct national particularities
Mm-hmm.
within this broader, say, economic web of interdependence that makes up the imperial lands. And I think this is also true even for today. I have made some flippant comments about, like, the land back narrative, and maybe some of them have been unkind even. But it's really more just speaking in my own defense. It's it's rooted in the recognition that there is this economic interdependence, which isn't going to go away. So I think Bauer actually does point to a continuing live question, even though he is formally only talking about Austria and the crown lands of a dead empire. It's still kind of a live question for all sorts of national minorities and all sorts of multi ethnic, multicultural states today.
Well, it's a good example of how like if diving into the particular realizes a universal.
Yeah.
in very much the Hegelian sense.
Yes.
But yeah, I think there's something there, and then building from that point, the connection of corporations, and I think this was like continuing my just question about proletarian nation theory is like, is this a corporatism of certain forms? Is this a positive corporatism? I don't actually have a lot of state, like I don't have a ton of knowledge of like the nature of corporatism or the political or economic ramifications of certain types of corporatism. So I think that's just a standing question that I had and was running throughout this text.
I feel like I wish I did have more of a knowledge of corporatism. Chris does.
Yeah, I think the lingering question I've had with corporatism is it similar to syndicalism, and that can be taken up by like labor syndicalism, political syndicalism, fascist syndicalism, uh,
Yeah.
or yeah, is that like yeah a similar understanding of corporatism then?
I think one thing is that just in an economic context, corporatism is based upon this recognition of permanence of classes, and corporatism is an attempt to harmonize the interests of the classes. And as socialists of some kind, the idea is at some point they're trying to move away from the concept of classes
Mm-hmm.
as an unnecessary and artificial division. So if for no other reason than that, I could see why a person might be skeptical of corporatist proposals and solutions. Although one day I would like to do a study of the economic thought of Nikolai Bukharin and the transition. And I think a corporatist vision is possibly part of the transition.
Mm.
Well, I think
Yeah.
I don't know. At a certain level, you just have to also acknowledge that there are like corporate political bodies, like they're like there are political bodies. There are groups of people that form like this like specific unity that like the term corporate is dealing with in the first place. But yeah, I like the point about the quote that you referenced earlier that the simplest form in which the realization of national autonomy can be imagined is the constitution of the nation as a territorial corporation. Which like I I like that. I think that's why his like critique of the territorial principle is, or is it principle, whatever, the territorial whatever is good, because it doesn't like, it accounts for why it's arisen as like a form, like this is the simplest form that you can realize this sort of autonomy is by saying that this territory like belongs to this nation. But once again, that this is only the mere, like this is actually simple, it is only the simplest form, which in a certain sense actually like excludes from view, or like appears as like this immediate like given, like okay, of course we share this space and like we're all a part of the same, but like that's actually not given. The reason that everyone in a certain like space or nation, territorial corporation is able to like meet with their fellow like nation members and like identify and interact with each other and know like to a certain level where like they're all coming from, even if they don't know the particularities of that person, is because of all these other layers of mediation and corporation and national culture, which all is like still territorial, like tied to territory to some extent or another, to the extent that territory like facilitates the social intercourse of people. But yeah, it once again it integrates this sort of yeah, this understanding, this simplistic understanding, and says like, well, no, it's actually a part, like it's not just dummy shit. Once again, I think that's a big thing. Like when you're doing critique, you can't just be like, oh, the people who believe this thing that I'm critiquing are a bunch of dummies and I can't believe, and this is really what things
Mm-hmm.
are like. It's like, no, there's a reason why people have come to view like things according to this territorial principle. And like I don't know, I think it's even interesting like where he makes a big point about linguistic like borders and whatnot having to do with like where landed property lies. Like there is, going back to a little bit earlier, like yeah, there's this constant like intermixing of like economic and political determinants, in a way that isn't necessarily like obviously unidirectional all the time, and like which one is the ultimate determinant of the other, but also that they can't like ultimately escape one another either, and that the way that they interact are in these like very bizarre roundabout ways a lot of the time. Sometimes it's a lot more straightforward. But
Hmm.
also, uh, as to the language specifically of proletarian nation, like I wanted, because I think I brought this up in an earlier episode, where I basically asked, like, could we, I think this was in discussion with socialist nations and not proletarian nations, but like, is there a difference between like asserting like nations under like national autonomy as an integral part of proletarian demands versus the proletarian nation like as a name for a thing that the proletariat is demanding, like the proletariat should demand this thing called a proletarian nation, and like does the distinction between those like sort of make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense in that the call for like a proletarian nation is the call of like is a call for class collaboration within whatever that nation is,
Yeah,
but a like proletarian but like a socialist state is going to like have class conflict, and also like a proletariat call for national autonomy is not a proletariat call for a proletarian nation.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would say that that's a significant and critical difference. That like that's making a virtue out of a necessity, and it's
Exactly.
problematic. Like, if there is a proletarian demand for national autonomy, we should, you know, whatever, the social democratic movement should get out in front of it and try to respond to the concerns of the affected people. But that's different than saying, well, since this demand exists, let's reshape it and make it into a new kind of demand. Like that's how you get whatever. It has been historically proven to be less than helpful.
Hmm.
Well, and I think it actually point because Bauer is like he's very careful about not collapsing class and nation, right? Like these aren't just two different like
Yeah,
ways of grouping people. Like there's a essential distinction between what a class is and what a nation is, and I think that's really the important like that distinction has to be like that has to be maintained. Like at a certain point, like you can make like I think the proletarian nation arguments you were saying earlier with like especially like Maoist third worldist stuff, you get this sort of like justification of the domestic bourgeoisie in a colonized nation because in this sort of like they view the relation of those bourgeoisie to the international like bourgeois like class as a whole as being what the proletariat is to the bourgeoisie. Like there's this, it's almost an analogous sort
right.
of thinking that yeah I think it doesn't quite work. Yeah, I think that's got to be like I think that's a big thing with a lot of this Bauer stuff is like class and nation do have to be seen as distinct, but obviously still dialectically intertwined with one another.
In a lot of ways, he's right too, in that like the nation does still continue to exist after whatever type of socialist revolution you want to
100%.
envision. So the nation is either going to exist as a reactionary force, like the concept of the nation is either going to exist as like a reaction to socialism, uh, or it's going to be in the same way that like Lunacharsky would wanted God building to incorporate socialist characteristics into like what religion could then become. That's kind of like what Bauer's doing with the nation.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good direct comparison that should be more obvious, but maybe that's what we're trying to do here. Over time, we're trying to make these things obvious
The Soviet Union also incorporated both of their ideas without ever saying it.
without ever giving the recognition.
Yes.
Which is it's the reason why it's a problem is not because the whatever people don't get their due, although that's whatever, that's a problem too. It's an issue because You fast forward a few decades, and we're having to relearn these things, and we shouldn't have to relearn these things.
Exactly. Yeah. Moving forward, I really on 261. He just says very explicitly the emergence and growth of these language islands, which is what Bauer is kind of describing as these. If the nation is going to exist as this territorial entity, there are going to be minorities of other nations within the territorial entities, and that's actually he says the emergence and growth of these language islands is much more important for the development of the nations than the insignificant displacement of the linguistic border. And I think he's highlighting something there that's like the nation, in a lot of ways, is fed and grows and develops through its existence as a minoritized community in other areas, not as a majoritarian state apparatus. The Irish nationalism of Northern Ireland is what I wrote down in my notes. Is that like a lot of what we understand is like Irish unity, like as like out and proud Irish concepts, comes from the Irish emigre community.
Right.
A lot of people in Ireland feel like Irish identity is important to them, but isn't like a central aspect. And so the development of the Irish identity and the Irish nation from that like conceptual philosophical framework is actually being led by these national islands, not just language islands, but also national islands in the case of Irish.
I mean, I could say just from my own very small scale uh, personal experience, I never really cared much or was even conscious of, never really thought about being Southern until I moved to the Midwest. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, wow, I'm super Texan. I'm super Southern. In the same way, I didn't really care about being an American. Like, I mean, whatever. I was never like opposed to it. It was never like shameful. It was never important to me. I was just, well, I live here, so I am whatever. I am an American. Then I lived in Turkey, and I was like extremely profoundly daily reminded of just how not Turkish I am. So now, by virtue of existing in the context of an antithetical context, my identity as an American, as a Southerner, as a Texan, has become pronounced. And those are things that they weren't like temporary. I carry those with me now in a way that I just don't know if I would be as conscious of them or care as much about them if I wasn't first, like if I wasn't as an immigrant, you know?
No, I think this is like an articulation of like the whole, and we can like the logic of community, of reciprocal and mutual interaction, and like this, like you don't learn those sorts of things until you go and interact with people who aren't the same as you and don't have the same backgrounds, and all of a sudden like there still has to be this exchange. Like you couldn't, like, I don't know, like Jason, you couldn't just go and like watch a documentary on Turkey and really fully comprehend the distinctiveness of your own upbringing. Like you could look at it and gawk at it, but I think there's like the element of like actually having to interact and like say and communicate things to other people, from this different context. That really, that yeah, there has to be this mutual reciprocal interaction. And I think, I don't know, like Bauer's so, and I don't want to jump too ahead because I think there's still stuff we need to go through before this. But when he's talking about the Jewish peoples in Central and Western Europe later, like it's very much that, like, still there's like it's a two-sided dialectic thing. Like they're almost like, his argument is almost that they're entering into too much exchange to where they don't have their own like space without getting like kind of just brought into the general flow of like daily life in the like social world that they're in, that it becomes difficult. Like there has to be
Mm-hmm.
both this, like there has to be that territorial island, that island where people are developing their like language, or like this identity kind of has its like home reference point. But it also like has to constantly be having people go out and go interact with other people, and that's kind of what historical nationhood does. I gotta find this quote where he's talking about the Czech people. But yeah, like I don't know. I think that just articulates that, and I think Bauer does throughout this whole book does a really good job at like kind of working through that dialectic. Let me find this quote.
I think the fact that we are 43 minutes into the discussion and we are almost down past the to the bottom of the first page of notes, I think it's okay if we jump around, especially
Okay.
since there are only three of us. And Trent, I would say that if we had to do a quick encapsulation of a truncated version of the point of the entire last section, you just did it. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's more, of course, but that's the main. He's not like when he's talking about the territorial autonomy for the Jews as a question mark, and he is not coming out as a strong proponent of it. The reason why you just laid out, and he makes that distinct comparison to the Czechs in Bohemia because of a whole bunch of reasons, and I think maybe you're going to read them out, and if not, then we will later.